Our next speaker is Ritika Goel. The title of her presentation is Immigration and Health in 2014, Reinforcing Marginalization. Ritika Goel is a family physician and an activist in Toronto. She works with women and men experiencing homelessness as well as people with precarious status. She is a volunteer physician and board member of the Scarborough Community Volunteer Clinic for the Uninsured and an organizer with Health for All, a migrant justice organization that believes in access to health for all people, irrespective of immigration status. She is also involved in organizing around Medicare, poverty, and homelessness. Ritika is a regular media contributor to the Huffington Post Canada, Healthy Debate, and Twitter at Ritika Goel TO. Welcome, Ritika.
Thank you so much. I just get a drink of water. So I decided to go old school and not do PowerPoint, and I'm going to hide behind this really big thing, so I hope you can see me. I just wanted to say, first of all, that it's so energizing to be in a room full of women and women of color, so can we just have a round of applause for the audience? I know I'm so populist, right? So just to start, the last presentation really kind of set the context, and I feel like I don't even need to speak now, but there's so many things that are to be said, and I think a lot of the work that we've been doing, I've been organizing in migrant justice issues over the last several years, a lot of the work that we've been doing has been really reactive because things have been getting worse in a sense in the last decade. But I do want to make sure that we are grounded in the fact that we are talking about a state with a history of colonization. Just recently, we passed the 100-year anniversary of the Komagata Maru. People put up their hands if they know what that is. Awesome. So a ship full of Indian, Punjabi mostly, people that came, I think it was 376 passengers that came to the shores of Canada, the large majority, aside from 20 or so of whom were turned away. So that was 100 years ago, so that's not just the Conservative government, that's not just Stephen Harper, that is about the Canadian state and the history that we come with. However, in the last decade, in some ways things have been worsening in a very overt manner, and there's a few different things that have specifically been happening that I'd like to talk about. So first of all, to set the stage, because even though many of us may have come as migrants ourselves, the immigration system is really complicated, and I want to just break it down a little bit for people so we're all on the same page. It's important to recognize that there is a spectrum of precarity. So obviously the most stable status is citizenship, and then after that you have permanent residency, and then there's this giant category of temporary foreign status, temporary foreign workers, temporary status for various categories, and then you have people that are completely undocumented, and they may be going through a process like applying for inland sponsorship, or they might be applying for humanitarian and compassionate grounds, but they're effectively non-status in terms of what their legal situation is, and they can be deported in that status. So in the recent years, the things that have been happening, and all of these, of course, disproportionately impact women, I feel can be categorized under three major groups. The first is that we have increasingly been making every level of status less secure. The second is that we have systematically been excluding people that are considered economically less viable. And the third is that the government has very clearly been fueling anti-immigrant sentiment with their rhetoric. So speaking about the first, increasingly making every level of status less secure, you may have heard of Bill C-24. This is something that's going through right now. And this is something that is, it may seem like a minor change. We're talking about permanent residents having to now wait 4 years instead of 3 years. But this comes on the heels of having made the citizenship test more difficult. It comes on the heels of having much stricter language requirements for citizenship than previously. And also this will make the process, this includes processing times that can be 1 to 3 years long. So really we're talking about sometimes a decade before people are able to get that secure citizenship status. And maybe this wouldn't matter as much if permanent residency was a secure status, but it's not. Because part of what's also happening under Bill C-45, and I think this relates to the case actually that was discussed, is that if you have been convicted of a crime, which can have a sentence of 6 months, minimum of 6 months, which actually can include some not so major crimes, you can be deported with a permanent residency. This for me is mind-blowing because I had permanent residency for years and years and years and just, delayed doing my citizenship test because it was just, I was just lazy. And I had this sense that as a permanent resident, I was secure, but really we are not secure anymore. I actually have 2 men that are going through having had criminal charges and are facing deportation right now. And although it is men in terms of criminal charges that may be a bit more susceptible, we always have to remember the women that are often economically dependent to those men and how they are impacted. So Bill C-45, I said permanent residents can be deported with a criminal charge. Bill C-24, the one that's going through now, also includes clauses about being able to revoke citizenship. So this is revolutionary in the wrong sense of now being able to even take away citizenship from people. There's a case right now, people may have heard of a young man who was born and raised in Canada, whose family came here as diplomats. And he was born here, his family's from India, and the government is now, when he is an adult, contesting that he was born when they were diplomats and therefore he wasn't eligible for citizenship, even though, he's saying that they weren't diplomats anymore. And so this man who's born and raised in Canada, and I believe it said has never even been to India, is potentially being considered to be deported deported to India, which is just sort of not imaginable. There's also been this substantial change from permanent status to temporary status. So if you look at a graph that shows the influx of migrants to Canada, there's this huge rise in people coming in under temporary status. And the idea really is we bring people in, we kind of extract their labor, don't provide them the same rights, and we don't provide them a path to citizenship, aside from the live-in caregiver program, which someone mentioned. Aside from that, you kind of bring people over, and then you make it very difficult for them to be able to get a path to citizenship. The best example of this is seasonal agriculture workers who are actually required to go back after having worked a few years, and that's because they don't want them to lay roots. So it's a very clear process that is designed to make migrants kind of the underclass of workers in Canadian society. Of course, when we talk about temporary workers, live-in caregivers are predominantly women of Filipino origin, and while they are provided a path to citizenship, unlike many other temporary workers, there are lots and lots of problems of being an employee living in your employer's home. And there's lots of problems about how live-in caregivers get used as servants. There's issues of sexual abuse with live-in caregivers, and there's issues of employers using the fact that the employer basically has control over whether or not you end up getting citizenship, using that against them and hanging that over their head and using that to exploit them, essentially. The second piece is about systematically excluding people that are considered economically less viable, and you can imagine where women and girls fall on that spectrum. So under Bill C-31, refugee processing times have been dramatically decreased. We heard about this recently. So this means now that while previously you might have come and made a refugee claim, your hearing might have been 8 months later, a year later, sometimes even more. Now everybody is supposed to have a hearing within 60 days. So that's not even, you have to submit your documents within 15 days, but you have a hearing within 60 days. So you can imagine women that have experienced gender-based violence as the reason for their persecution and the reason for them fleeing the situation, having to disclose that information immediately. And as was recently mentioned, working with women that have experienced violence, that is something that is very difficult to slowly extract out of people. And there's huge issues with having to make a statement within 15 days when often women that have experienced trauma have issues with their memory. They might have blocked out certain things that have happened. And if they make a statement at 15 days and then they recall other parts of the trauma at 60 days when the hearing is, that discrepancy in information can be used against them to say that, well, you didn't tell us this at 15 days, so obviously now you must be fabricating the whole situation. So what we're seeing is that we now have historically low refugee claim acceptance rates. We're also seeing that while in the Western world, the general rates of refugee claimants are going up, in Canada they're going down. And the reason is because people that are marginalized across the world know that Canada does not want them. we've made it clear that if you come here from a so-called safe country, we are going to process you quickly, we're not going to give you access to healthcare services, and we're going to send you home. So people are not coming anymore. This is predominantly targeted people from Hungary, the Roma population from Hungary, as well as people from Mexico, which tends to, in my experience, largely be women escaping gender-based violence. We also heard a little bit about the sponsored spouse requirement of staying in a relationship for 2 years. Technically, whenever I bring this up and someone kind of really knows the law, they'll say, well, technically there's an exclusion. If you're experiencing violence and you documented that, and there's very strict procedures, if you documented it and you're having violence, etc., if you're able to do that, technically there's an exclusion. But the reality is about systems, and it's about barriers, and it's about what things effectively end up being. So you can put in the law that there's an exclusion for women experiencing violence, but the reality on the ground is that this creates more precarity for women. You may also know about the restriction on parents and grandparents. So there was a complete ban put on sponsoring parents and grandparents, and instead they put in place a super visa. The idea was that the super visa would allow people to come in and out for 10 years, but here's the catch. You have to have up to, I think it was 100,000 or 1 million, I forget, some crazy number of coverage for health insurance. And so the idea is that you can bring in, first of all, you have to be able to afford health insurance coverage for your elderly parents and grandparents who may have all sorts of pre-existing conditions or are unlikely to be covered by any useful kind of health insurance. And if you can afford that, you can bring them in, but we're not going to care for them, so you figure your own system out. And then the third piece is fueling anti-immigrant sentiment. So I'm sure people around the room have heard terms like bogus claimants, queue jumpers. We're talking about how refugee claimants get access to gold-plated healthcare. I don't really consider being able to get a dental checkup gold-plated healthcare, but that's the rhetoric that we're hearing. Why are Canadians not able to access the things that refugees who haven't paid into our system are accessing? There's no acknowledgement of the fact that refugees are fleeing persecution. When they come here, they're mostly eligible for social assistance and therefore are marginalized and should be able to access the same benefits that people in Canada on social assistance access, which is really all that the Refugee Health Program ever provided. And we're also being told that women that come here and have their babies are taking advantage of us and are abusing our generosity, etc. So there's a lot of targeting of migrants, there's a lot of dividing of us versus them. And it's also interesting, right, because us speaks to a particular group. It speaks to the white Canadian population. It does not speak to people that were historically of Canadian heritage in terms of the Aboriginal population. And so why is this happening? There's many, many reasons. I think a lot of them are ideological. One piece of it, I think, in terms of delaying people's access to citizenship is that you cannot vote until you're a citizen. So if you're able to prevent migrants from getting access to voting rights, they don't matter, and two, you can do whatever you want because they don't really have a voice in the same way. And the second, I think, is this notion of using migrants as the underclass, which is, something that we've seen historically. This is how imperialism works. This is how colonialism works. You need a group that you can exploit to be able to get forward. In terms of healthcare coverage and access to healthcare, there have been major setbacks recently with the refugee healthcare coverage being cut. I want to tell you a couple of quick anecdotes to show you how across the spectrum of precarity people can be impacted. You may know that new immigrants, when they come to Ontario, go through a 3-month waiting period for health insurance. How many people knew about that? Okay, so most people know. So that happens in Ontario, that happens in British Columbia, and that happens in Quebec. Quebec actually has an exclusion for pregnant women. I don't know how often that ends up actually getting used. But I had interviewed a woman who was 35, originally from Nigeria, and had traveled to Europe, and she was working there, and she had put in for immigration in Canada. When she got access to immigration, when she was finally approved, after waiting 3 or 5 years, she happened to be pregnant. She was highly educated, able to advocate for herself, read all of the documentation about what was accessible to her. She found all about Canada's wonderful universal healthcare program, saw nothing about a 3-month waiting period. When she arrived, the first thing she did was go to the OHIP office, and that's that is when she heard about the 3-month waiting period. So she started calling around to obstetricians. She was quite far into her pregnancy, so people refused to take her. She tried to get access to private health insurance, which we're told, new immigrants, they can just get private health insurance. She was denied because she had a pre-existing condition, which is her pregnancy. So she could not get access to private health insurance. She could not get access to an obstetrician. She ended up going into labor. At this time, she was living at a shelter with her other child. She went into labor. There were complications. She had an emergency C-section, and she ended up walking out with a bill for $12,000, which she was paying off in installments of $50 a month. So you can imagine, I want to read a quote from her. She said, "They don't inform you before coming to Canada that there's a 3-month waiting period. They send you an immigration package. It talks about free healthcare. It doesn't talk about a 3-month waiting period in it. The hospital and the charges, it's a whole lot of money. The person just comes to the country, you haven't settled yet, you haven't got a job yet, and then you start by having bad credit, owing everywhere. They create a world of debt which one cannot imagine how it can be solved. And that, to me, for an immigrant, is disastrous." Now, this is a woman, when you look at the spectrum of immigration and how one can come to Canada, she's the one that people would say we're doing it right. She applied through the immigration system, she went through the point system, she waited her turn, she came, she read all the documentation, and still the system completely failed her. So you can only imagine what happens to people that come as refugees or people that come that are uninsured. In terms of refugees, previously what would happen, just to simply explain it, previously what happened is that if you came as a government-assisted refugee, you had access to OHIP right away. You also had access to the Interim Federal Health Program, IFH, which would allow you to get medications and drug coverage, dental coverage. And then if you were a refugee claimant, meaning you arrived and you made a claim, you had a similar coverage for the duration of your processing. So while you're going through it, if you had an appeal, etc., you would be able to get access to healthcare services. What happened now is that people that come from certain countries, and mostly this impacts people from Mexico, Hungary, and Chile, but includes also all the other European countries, they now effectively get no access to healthcare services. This means that they are not insured if they have a heart attack, if they need prenatal care, if they have a sick child, they are not insured by the federal government anymore. The Ontario government has technically stepped in and said that they are filling the gap. The problem is that physicians have to go through the process, put in a claim to the federal government first, wait for that claim to be declined, and then resubmit the claim to the province, and then the province will cover it. I don't know a single person that has actually gone through this process. So basically what is happening is that if somebody is a refugee, physicians are just refusing to see them. I saw a woman a week ago at the Scarborough Clinic who unfortunately experienced a decade of sexual slavery, who's come here, has an 8-year-old son who doesn't listen to her and is acting out, and she has a 3-year-old child. She's completely overwhelmed. We tried to send her to a psychiatrist and they just refused because she's a refugee, and she actually has coverage. And finally, undocumented people obviously have no coverage whatsoever. There's an estimated 500,000 people in Canada that are undocumented. This is thought to be an underestimate because we're trying to count people who are trying their hardest to not get counted. And I can think of many, many examples of women that have been impacted, mostly because when you think about the population of migrants, it tends to be people in their 20s to their 40s, and that's when women are in childbearing age. So the most common healthcare issue for people that are uninsured that I always see is pregnancy. And this is where our midwifery colleagues are really helpful. If we've got any midwives in the crowd, I love you guys, because midwives in Ontario are actually paid per unit and not based on OHIP. So if you know any woman who is uninsured and is pregnant, you can always refer them to a midwife. So I get that I'm out of time. So all I want to say really is that I think everybody generally has a sense of the issues. I think we all kind of understand that we need to stick together, we need to fight these out. Health for All has been doing exactly that, and we urge you to join us in the struggle, to fight back, to not accept what's happening, and to recognize that anything that we have is because we fought for it, and anything that we're going to get back will be because we fight for it in the future. Thank you.